Hi, and welcome to The Loneliness Industry, a podcast where we decode the societal bullshit that parades as wisdom and serves to keep you stuck. If you're listening for the first time, I'm Jordan Reyne, a philosophy graduate with a severe allergy to self-help gurus, and my own way out of debilitating loneliness began when I realised that the very discourses claiming to solve our problems really just cleverly perpetuate them. Now, if you're already following, welcome, and thank you for being here. I am glad for new listeners, return listeners, and thanks for tuning in. And if you are a returning listener, you'll notice I have pushed back the episode on heteronormativity because a few things just made this one more necessary. It's life, sometimes it throws things at you that stir up new thoughts or reveal the need to clarify old ones, actually. So today, what I really want to do is to drill down into what might be the solution to loneliness, connection, and make it really clear how the values that we hold as a society make that connection so damn difficult. My hope is that in understanding that the real solutions, the ones that we're not shown in therapy or self-help books, might become a little clearer. So 2 things sparked this episode. One was an obviously well-meaning, but unfortunately missing the point comment on YouTube. It made me realise I really need to pull everything together that we've explored so far to understand that loneliness isn't just personal, it's structural. And in many ways, it's become a precondition for existing in this society. So this episode's a way of bringing all of the things together that we've talked about in the last few episodes so far and how they relate to loneliness. And the second part was a very real experience that I didn't know if I want to share, but it relates so directly to loneliness and made me think so much about the mechanics of it that I'm going to share it. As I said in the very first episode, I'm not doing this because I'm healed. Loneliness is so hard to escape in our culture that I'm still as plagued by it as anyone else. So it was just one of those evenings where the loneliness was so intense, it felt like a physical ache, and I needed to be around people. Not because being around people always leads to connection, because often it just doesn't. I'm sure you all know how profoundly alone you can feel when you're in the company of others and there's no real openness there. But, as a middle-aged single person living with a dog, being around people still seemed like a better bet than sitting at home. And somehow that night, there was someone there who really let themselves be seen and who let me be seen in return. A person who was not performing, someone who was actually really there, really open and present, and probably also lonely, but warm and human and real. So, one of those things where you talk for hours and laugh a lot and drift into those rare, unguarded places where nothing needs to be explained and nothing feels like too much. For me, it was the kind of connection that just lands in your body like a memory from the future, like something you didn't even know you were missing until it arrives. It felt like home, like not home like familiar, because those of you like me and have grown up in families that felt like an unsupervised psychiatric ward, familiar can be dangerous. This is a different kind. This is a real home. Something else entirely. It was safety. It was mutuality, and it felt rare. And then the time was up. And the experiences like that, they are so uncommon in a world like this now, and in a country like this even more so. So it hit me hard and just made me think about all the different ways in which intimacy is blocked, and not just by things like logistics, as in our case, and not just because of things like timing or fear or personal stuff that we often cite, but also because of the values we're taught to hold too dear. In so many cases, we're taught to close off, to override what we long for, to override ourselves before we even open up. And sometimes we become so starved of real, authentic closeness that we hang on to broken connections just to avoid being alone. And I've done the latter one a few times myself. But that's just some of how our culture actively interferes with connection before it has a chance to take root. So that's where we're going today, how our societal values actively block intimacy and connection. And the experience reminded me that you don't have to be a queer, middle-aged person living with their dog to feel the full force of loneliness. You can feel it in your family of origin. You can feel it in a crowd with friends who never open up, or in a relationship where your partner doesn't see you anymore. And my own loneliness, it feels so deep and chronic sometimes that I just don't know what to do with it. And I know I'm not alone in that. This is a story that many of us live, just in different settings, in different constellations. And of course, a lot of people would respond to this with, get therapy. And whilst therapy can help us make sense of our feelings, and, some therapists will even congratulate you on doing something productive with your pain, but they still can't conjure connection. Therapy can't undo the values that have conditioned us to live in competition and to mistrust intimacy and to prize control over vulnerability. And that's why today I want to explore the tension between psychology's focus on the individual and sociology and philosophy's attention to the broader systems shaping our lives. Because it's never just one or the other. Yet we're so conditioned to focus on the individual, it means we blame ourselves for feeling lonely, while staying blind to the wider isolation that we're swimming in, the wider isolation that we're drowning in, the wider isolation that's drowning us all. And I want to pause here, because what we're swimming in, the system and the structures and the institutions that uphold it, that is what this podcast is really about. Now, a search for how to deal with loneliness, that's going to turn up a number of podcasts or articles, and nearly every single one of them will focus on you, what you might have done wrong, what you should do, as if loneliness is just a personal failing, a lack of effort or insight or of self-worth, as if all around you, everyone else, is part of a rich web of community. And trust me, I've done therapy. I've done so much therapy. Sometimes I feel like there's no modality that you could name that I haven't sat through or actually studied. Like a lot of you, I've read the books, done the work, dug through the trauma, bought the commodifying t-shirt, and yet I feel painfully alone most days. And there comes a point where you've done everything they say you should do and still feel isolated. And that's when it hits you. Even though our culture makes it almost forbidden to say it, the problem isn't you, it's society. Now, I might be struck by lightning or assassins or self-righteous, spiritual but not religious people for saying that. It's anathema to the self-help industrial complex, to the wellness world, to certain kinds of therapy too, because they depend on you believing that you are the one that's flawed. That your pain means you haven't taken enough responsibility, that you haven't worked hard enough, that you still, somehow, despite having done so much of it, just need more therapy. But I'm here to say, no, society is sick, and trying to adjust to a sick society may well make you sicker. If you've failed to adjust, if you can't contort yourself into the shape this world demands, consider it a good sign. It might just mean you're not dead inside yet. And with that, on with the podcast. I'm heading this section, Western Cultural Values and Disconnection, or How to Mass Produce Loneliness. As mentioned, the aim here is to bring together everything we've discussed about capitalist values so far, specifically how they prevent real connection and, in doing so, make loneliness not just likely, but compulsory. We'll be delving into a lot of opposites. Opposites always gain their meaning from each other. Their meaning is kind of shaped by the thing they're opposite to. What we're going to do is look at how the assertion of something being good, such as individualism, gives birth to its opposite, things like codependence, being labelled as bad. We're also going to look at how the opposite of loneliness, which is connection, is actively blocked by what we've decided is good or bad in terms of the values we hold dear. This means we're going to talk directly too about what is deemed sick, because central to this episode is how our culture pathologizes the opposite of its ideals. To value individualism so highly, for example, means that we're going to end up labeling our natural human need for one another as bad. Therapy represents what we are meant to grasp for as a solution to these pathologies. And in doing so, it often blinds us to a more critical perspective. As an example, the perspective of Mate, Bowlby and others is that we actually become ill when we are unable to connect and rely on each other. The term interdependence is an attempt to destigmatize our inherent need for co-reliance on one another. The fact that we still have to go to therapy, however, to correct what we see as a flaw exposes how placing the burden on individuals is not only unjust, but ultimately self-defeating. Foucault might put it this way: therapy often functions less as a liberation and more as a normalization. It teaches us how to conform better to an unjust system, rather than teaching us how to question it. And I don't know about you, but if I get the impression I'm not allowed to question something, it makes me even more inclined to question it. So, now I want to talk about loneliness versus connection. As any philosopher will tell you, one must begin by defining one's terms. And we've already defined key concepts like individualism, the hero narrative, control, cognitive primacy, and competition in the previous episodes. Now it's time to define loneliness, and not in a clinical or self-help way, but in a critical framework that this podcast is grounded in. So here we go. Loneliness is not simply being alone. It is the absence of reciprocal recognition. It is the experience of not being seen, felt, or mirrored. Now, that framing draws on people like Carl Jung, who observed that loneliness does not arise from a lack of people, but from feeling unable to communicate things that are deeply important to oneself, whether because those things just go unheard or unrecognized, or because you feel like you can't mention them in the first place. And it's worth considering going further with this definition too. Hannah Arendt warns pretty bleakly that loneliness is the common ground of terror, the condition that allows totalitarianism to flourish by severing relational bonds. Hardcore. Lauren Berlant looks at something called affective infrastructures, meaning how institutions and cultural norms shape what kind of emotional connections are possible or impossible. So both of these theorists draw our attention to the idea that loneliness isn't just about the disconnection that our definition so far elucidates. It is produced, it is political, and it is deeply tied to the values Western capitalism teaches us to hold dear. And this is what inclines me to add a second part to the definition of loneliness, and one that you've probably heard me say before. Loneliness is not a personal failure, but a structural and relational wound. So now our working definition is as follows. Loneliness is not simply being alone. It is the absence of reciprocal recognition. It is the experience of not being seen, felt, or mirrored. And loneliness is not a personal failure, but a structural and relational wound. So clearly it's pretty horrible, right? So what stops us being lonely? And whether or not you're okay with the second part of our definition, we can still see pretty clearly what's implied in terms of solutions. If loneliness is the absence of being seen or felt, or of reciprocal recognition, then the antidote becomes intimacy and connection. At its core, human connection is built on intimacy. Yep, and we've even commodified and transactionalized that word so much that half of you will think I'm talking about sex, and I'm not, because intimacy is not necessarily linked to sex at all. Think about it. Most of us, I've checked the stats on this, most of you and me are over 40 here, so you've likely learned the hard way that sex can be one of the most meaningless, hollow, and soul-destroying acts that there are if the person you're with is a total asshole or a client or whatever. And yeah, so sex does not always involve intimacy, even though it can, of course. Intimacy is more than physical touch and may not involve physical touch at all. Intimacy is letting ourselves be known and being curious and open enough to know the other. So intimacy requires mutual openness. It requires vulnerability and truth-telling. It is about sharing our inner world and having it received, not judged, exploited, or ignored, and accepting the world of another. So close friendships, obviously, are intimate too, or can be. And relationships with family can be intimate, if your family aren't mostly certifiable lunatics, at least. Now, if the very values we hold dear mean that real mutual openness, vulnerability, and truth-telling are precluded, that is the structural element of connection being doomed. So if our culture thinks showing emotions is weakness, for example, and insists we don't show it, and vulnerability is essential to intimacy, voila, we have a structural barrier to connection. And as usual, you don't just have to take my word for any of this stuff. This is exactly what a lot of thinkers and authors have already suggested. For example, Bell Hooks, in her book All About Love, writes that love cannot exist without honesty. And Hooks also notes that love exists in friendships too. Did you feel that? I wonder if you felt it. Most of our connection words, love, intimacy, they kind of draw us towards the idea that they apply to only one other person, like our lover, a partner, or a spouse. And that's no accident either, and we're gonna deal with that later on. But back to Hooks. And Hooks is not just talking about romantic love. She's talking about the conditions for any kind of loving relationship and the absolute necessity of authenticity as opposed to performativity. In chapter 3, for any of you who want to find this afterwards, which is called Honesty, Be True to Love, she writes that lies may make people feel better, but they do not help them to know love. That in a culture that rewards performance and self-protection and the branding of the self, the kind of truth-telling required for intimacy becomes rare. If we are consistently managing impressions or commodifying ourselves, we are less able to engage in the kind of relationships that would truly see us. We're not even showing our true selves to be seen, right? And this is one of the most devastating impacts of capitalism on our emotional lives. It trains us to think of connection not in terms of trying to really see the other or of opening ourselves to really being seen. Rather, it teaches us to look at all kinds of relationships in transactional terms. What am I offering? Because, what do people normally look like? And can I offer them that? And, what am I getting in return? In that framework, taking the emotional risk that intimacy demands seems kind of foolish. And without taking the emotional risks required for intimacy, connection becomes shallow and scripted and strategic. Things that may reduce social isolation on paper, but not emotional loneliness in practice. Transactional relationships can be seen everywhere too. The classic pairings between, some rich person and their partner is, their job is to make said rich person look good, and the partner enjoys luxury. So each is getting something, but neither is getting love, not the way that Hooks terms it. With transactional relationships, that's typical. They're not about connection anyway, and quite often it's about something entirely other, such as control. And we will get to that here today as well. But first, to the importance of connection and what it facilitates, intimacy. Now, that probably looked like a really bad edit because my dog just vomited and I had to tidy it up. So, sorry if I probably jumped from one place to another. So, evidence that intimacy is a need and not a nice to have. Gabor Mate, who I mention a lot on this podcast, and others have shown that intimacy is not optional for our well-being. It's actually essential. Mate points to the importance of relational safety, of having relationships where we can express pain, fear, confusion, and still feel loved. This kind of connection is protective against the toxic effects of stress, trauma, and, of course, loneliness. But under capitalist values of control, competition, and self-sufficiency, these conditions are hard to come by. So what Mate and others show is that we need space to be known. And that means a number of things. It means having the time and energy for conversations that aren't optimized or efficient. It means environments where emotions aren't seen as weakness. And it means relationships where we're not treated as projects to be fixed or tools to be used or the means to an end. And finally, we need a culture that makes room for mutual care rather than constant self-management. In short, the very things that might stop us from being lonely are the very things capitalism discourages us from doing at all, showing vulnerability, being interdependent, and being honest. Our culture trains us not to do the things that would lead to connection and intimacy. In fact, we're trained to be ashamed of the things that would. And this is where the well-meaning, overly indoctrinated people start yelling at us, "You're this bummed out about being lonely, so go to therapy." Thus buying into exactly the idea that issues like loneliness are automatically and purely personal, and that the solution is purely clinical. They're buying right into the idea that it is we as individuals who are malfunctioning in a perfectly normal environment. So it's just us being not healthy. cue Michel Foucault, who always gets cued at some point in this podcast. I should call him a friend of the podcast because he demonstrates just how deep this issue goes. And as I mentioned at the beginning of each episode, capitalist values, the ones that we've discussed so far, along with others, they shape what we think of as healthy and unhealthy, sane or insane, and good or bad. Now, Foucault argued that what a society defines as mad or deviant or ill, it's not fixed. It actually changes. And that change is dependent on what society values at the time. So like back in the days where religious institutions were those that essentially ruled and held power, for example, someone who thought they communicated with angels, as an example, they might have been called blessed. And this is because it fit perfectly with what those in power needed their subjects to believe at the time. So people seeing angels are believers, and they'd internalise the values of the controlling institution at the time, the church. Now, at that time, anyone saying, wait a second, mate, you're seeing angels, that's not okay. And all of those things, I can explain them by, let's say, physics. I can explain all of that event with physics. Now, that was punished. That might even have you put to death for heresy at the time. Then, of course, in post-Enlightenment Europe, the whole thing reverses. Rationality then became the most highly prized value, and it didn't fit at all with seeing angels. So this physics fan now is seen as the sane one, and the angel-seeing person is likely to be locked up in an institution. Now, you and I might sit here now and think, yeah, but come on, the angel-seeing person, that is nuts. That reaction isn't objective or neutral, though, right? It's shaped by the values we've been steeped in, values that tell us what counts as sane or successful or worthwhile. And Foucault's point is not that one system is more correct than another. The point is that each system constructs its own norms. And those norms shape what kind of human experiences are pathologized and which kinds are seen as completely normal. But you don't need to be seeing angels or be institutionalized to feel the effects of this either. If you've ever lived abroad, you've probably felt how differently your personality is interpreted in different cultural contexts. And I know I have. I've lived in Germany for many years, many years if you put them all together. And I am seen as, at best, eccentric, and most of the time irritating and crazy. And it's because I don't follow the expected scripts, and I kind of refuse to. I do not get excited about comparing the price of shit that I don't even need to buy. And I live in a way that does not align with deeply internalized norms here, like predictability and fitting into boxes. Now, some of you will have had this experience too, and you'll know that when your way of being disrupts the norms around you, you often get labelled as weird or essentially the problem. And even if you haven't lived overseas, I know that some of you are artists. So you know this, right? We are so often just called crazy anyway. It's partly why people call me crazy here. I live as an artist. And in Germany, I have actually not heard the word artist used without the word crazy in front of it here in Germany. That is how different that kind of lifestyle is to what their ideal is. So it's not because we are crazy for pursuing art. It's because often in any culture, our values will clash quite deeply, and in Germany particularly deeply. Prizes order, efficiency, and conformity, and we can look deranged in comparison. And those who have adopted all of those values and lived by them for a long time, they simply can't understand why someone else would not. Hence, the other person has to be nuts and need therapy. And also, if you come from a culture shaped by different religious or non-capitalist traditions, the gap becomes even more extreme. So people who've internalized Western capitalist norms are way more likely to label unfamiliar ways of being as irrational or weird, or even, as we're looking at here, pathological. Now, it's not just a cultural mismatch. It's often racism, classism, and xenophobia. And psychology, when wielded uncritically, becomes a weapon used to enforce dominant norms. So let's look at healthy versus unhealthy in Western capitalism. In Western capitalist societies, we support the values of things like productivity, self-management, competition, control, and rationality. These things reign supreme, among other things. If we say things like, I can't keep up anymore, or I don't feel in control of my life, that vulnerability is not met with care or solidarity. Instead, it's seen as a personal failure. a lack of strength, a lack of resilience or agency, and you're deemed not coping, which implies everybody else is, and that coping is a baseline for health. If you can't do it, well, yeah, trigger the whole self-help industry. It's like, I'm not coping. I should be coping. Coping is the norm. I must get assistance here. Because in this context of our culture, feelings of exhaustion and disconnection or emotional overload are pathologized. Rather than seeing them as a rational reaction to a relentless system, we're told that the problem is within us. And the self-help industry, along with countless therapists, they rush to restore individual functionality, to get us back to normal. But this normal is built on unsustainable values. Competition, hyperproductivity, self-optimization, control. Burnout clinics, they offer the same promise. Patch you up so that you can re-enter the cycle, even when the system causing the collapse remains unchanged. As Byung-Chul Han argues in The Burnout Society, we are no longer oppressed by external forces, but by internalized pressure to perform. We talked about this in the episode before this one. We exploit ourselves in the name of freedom, and collapse becomes the logical endpoint. In a world where everyone is expected to be a self-managing project, those who falter are deemed unhealthy, not because they are, but because they expose the system's violence. So when someone admits that they're lonely, it's not treated as a symptom of structural disconnection. It's framed as a flaw in them. Western capitalist values don't just cause loneliness, they encourage us to shame people for feeling it. They define health as the ability to just push on alone without complaint. Now let's get specific in terms of how our values keep us lonely. So by now, it really should be clear that feeling lonely doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. But if you're still floundering, that's understandable, because it is a mindfuck. Western cultural values actively produce loneliness and then turn it around to make it seem like it's your fault for feeling it. That's called gaslighting, right? It's like punching someone in the eye and saying, "Oh, it's your fault. You must have made me hit you." And this is a classic tactic, not just of narcissistic people, but of narcissistic societies. And as I keep promising, we will be diving deeper into that theme in upcoming episodes. Suffice to say, the only way to deal with gaslighting is to find clarity. And that's exactly what I want to offer here, okay? A clearer view of how each of these Western cultural values shapes our ideas of what good or bad are when it comes to connection. So we're now going to drill down into each of them, okay, one by one, each of the ones that we've covered at any rate. And we're going to start with independence. Now, independence, this is the heading of this section. Independence means depending on others is not allowed. At the beginning of this episode, we looked at how words like love and intimacy are often taken as referring to a specific kind of relationship, right? The romantic one, that one special person. I'm going to call it the romantic dyad, okay? So we're taught to kind of assume that when love and intimacy are being talked about, it is in reference to that romantic dyad rather than our other close relationships. And this reflects another aspect of Western culture, that this romantic dyad, the one special bond, is so loaded with importance that such pairings come with massive expectations. When wider kinship structures and community supports shrink, as they have in many Western cultures, we are left with a romantic dyad as our primary and often only source of emotional and practical support. Sociologist Eva Illouz has written extensively about this, noting how the erosion of extended social ties places enormous emotional weight on romantic relationships, which are now expected to provide everything, like meaning, belonging, identity, support, sex, security, you name it. That one dyad is supposed to provide all of that. That's a lot to ask. And even as we load all our expectations of love and intimacy onto that one special other, the romantic dyad, our cultural worship of individualism walks hand in hand with other moral ideals like independence and self-sufficiency. So yeah, got all of this expectation on someone for all our love needs, but we're supposed to be independent. Yeah, does that sound potentially problematic? Yes, but yet we still see these things as positive, right? So, self-sufficiency, independent, we see that as strong or noble even. And that's because Western culture places those values in the good column. So independence and self-sufficiency, they are good. Words that imply their opposites, stuff about depending on or needing others, those get marked as bad or flawed. And that badness can even become institutionally upheld as pathology. As we saw with Foucault, psychology has often acted as an institution that polices such categorizations, ensuring that if we falter on the values we are meant to hold, we will receive coaching or therapy or whatever to bring us back to the values that we're supposed to want to have in our lives. So now we have this overloaded romantic dyad, right, which is the only acceptable place to get our needs for intimacy and love met anyway, and yet we're also meant to exhibit independence and self-sufficiency. It's like when we come together in the romantic dyad, a beautiful spring is formed that both parties are allowed to drink from. But then, instead of drinking from that beautiful fountain that we've formed, we are told it's more admirable to do what amounts to drinking our own piss, because that is more self-sufficient. Brutal enough analogy for you? Let's look more closely at what we consider opposites to independence and self-sufficiency now. For example, words like we've mentioned before, codependence. This term became a buzzword in pop psychology and self-help circles, and both of these discourses urge us to see close reliance in relationships as inherently unhealthy. People who made each other their world were encouraged to diagnose themselves with this very pathologized codependency trait. The assumption behind it, that people who cannot look after their own needs are dysfunctional. But wait, rewind. Remember, we have just reduced the survival unit, the family unit, down to a maximum of 2 adults. Right, remember, human beings do need each other. So what do you think might occur when one person becomes your entire support system? What do you expect will happen when we associate the words love and intimacy primarily with the romantic dyad? What choice do you have but to rely on that one special person for your relational needs? Not to mention other needs like helping with and financing the kids, or building and maintaining a home, sex, intellectual stimulation, walking the dog, all of those things. Now, all of this isn't dysfunction, it's the inevitability of a flawed setup. You have to lean hard on each other because the setup is such that there's nowhere else to go. The very structure of our family unit encourages over-reliance, and then it shames it. This is a hideous double bind for which the proposed solution is self-reliance, meeting your own needs, or just having none at all, which makes you wonder if the end game is that we all conclude that it's better to just masturbate into a jar and hire a nanny. And whilst a worldwide wank fest may or may not be the telos of our species, as things stand, the connection of the couple bond is still pretty doomed, especially when there are kids involved, placing more needs into the mix. And the failure of this unit's ability to hold up under the pressure is reflected in divorce stats. But still, Western capitalism gives us this message loud and clear. Dependence is the problem. Reliance on others, bad. And all this means the real issues go unseen. For a start, this overloaded dyad where we're supposed to get all of our needs, but also a lack of connection or mutual presence. That is the real issue. And that lack of connection may come from that overloaded dyad, or just the fact that we're supposed to only look there for our intimacy needs. And blaming our need for one another as the problem simply reinforces the false ideal of the emotionally autonomous individual who needs no one. If you feel lonely in your relationship, you are told that the solution is to be a lone wolf, to need no one, to reduce your needs in terms of what the other might be able to bring to the table. And as you may have picked up on already, the not-so-subtext is your needs are too much. Hoping your partner might meet them is codependent. Now, this is obviously a fucking setup, right? You can't win. It is also a double whammy for anyone in a loveless marriage, because if you're feeling awful because you're enduring being unseen and unloved, you are then meant to conclude that you're also some kind of failure or weakling. Yep, your basic human need is not okay. You are meant to transcend it, like you're some sort of AI or robot. And it's easy to conclude that it is a weakness if you want to feel loved at all. And, if you're lucky enough not to be in a loveless marriage, the odds are heavily stacked against it staying that way. Not because there's anything horrible about either of the people involved, not because you will stop being lovable, not because your partner will either, but because society demands you rely so heavily on one another just to get by, that becoming distracted by childcare, by work, or whatever else it is that you have to organise together, it's just too hard to find the stuff that brings you close and facilitates intimacy. And returning to bell hooks, she also critiques this carving away of wider connections in favour of the two-adult maximum. In Chapter 8, Community, Loving and Communion, Hooks highlights our deep hunger for community, but she shows that this longing for a wider, deeper network has been flattened by individualism. She also challenges the idea that romantic love is the only kind that matters and calls for a re-evaluation of community, friendship and chosen families. In other words, love and intimacy can come from elsewhere. And no, this does not mean cheating and stuff like that. It means forming deep bonds with people outside the societally sanctioned dyad. But here I also want to take a closer look at the term codependent and this whole balance sheet of I give to get, right? In coining this term, we see the very mechanism by which our culture undermines our connection to this almost singular sanctioned lifeline. And it's there too in related words and terms that pathologize our need for one another, like people pleasing. That's another example. And I know there'll be a ton of people out there who want to chime in with, yes, 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 I'm one of those. Yeah, me too. But I want you to ask yourself, is it really so fucked up wondering, oh, what does this person who I love need right now? Is that not part of being connected? I mean, okay, to explain, I'm going to use a sports metaphor, and you know I hate them, so excuses in advance. Right, so imagine you're on a soccer team and all you're thinking about is what you need to shoot a goal. And the chances are you'll just run willy-nilly across the field, ignoring everyone or like even fighting your own team members in order to obtain the ball until you get the chance to shoot with said ball. My need is the ball so that, I can look like a hero. However, that would really be a shitty football game. You would not make the team if that was that was how you were working. What happens instead is, to actually achieve the goals, you'd be thinking, okay, so I'm actually all the way down the other end of the pitch, away from the goal. But my friend Jane, she's near the goal, and she's nowhere near the ball, but I'm near the ball. She needs the ball to shoot the goal, so how about I give her the ball? Yeah. That works. Your team will achieve the goal that you all have, right? The whole team wants goals to be shot. That's how community works, right? The people in it, they think of each other, meaning others think of you too. This is not all just about worrying. It's oh God, I'm wondering what does this person need, in this team that we have with the same goals. It's terrible that I'm wondering what they need. They're going to be wondering what you need as well, unless they're an asshole. But, generally speaking, that is the point. The problem is we live in this me first culture. So terms like codependent and people pleaser, they exist to tell us to put our own needs first. They exist to tell us me first, me first, me first. Get with the program, me first. These words, they come pre-wrapped in the warning and assumption that others would never think about your needs. They also come prepackaged in the idea that it is better to meet all your own needs anyway, rather than ever ask anyone else to. Now, given that we are living in an increasingly narcissistic world, you might say two things to this in response, right? And one is that this messaging is exactly what a person with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, would train you to do if you're in a relationship with them. Like, not need anything from them. I've done this several times, unfortunately. If you're in a relationship with someone with some horrible cluster B personality disorder, they train you to have no needs. They're not going to be met. And a lot of the time they'll also train you to think that it's bad that you have any in the first place. The fact that you're asking them, the cluster B nightmare, to fulfill any of your intimacy needs, then you're obviously some kind of codependent freak, and the problem is yours. Go look after your own needs. There is nothing I'm going to give you. That's how they work. They make you see yourself, as a burden and a freak. Now, the second thing you might say is that it has become fair to assume that everyone is out for themselves because society is increasingly narcissistic, right? But think about it. Assuming, before there's any actual evidence, right, that your own partner, this romantic dyad person, is a purely selfish fuck, that seems a little bit on the cynical side, because our other option is to assume that our romantic partner, who professes to love us back, might actually give us a bit of thought. And if they don't, and continually show a pattern of selfish fuckness, then you can and should leave. And you can and should smear dog shit all over their car. However, working on the assumption that all others, including your special connection, think about no one but themselves, is really like to lead us down that path where we're all too scared to connect with anybody at all. Maybe that's the plan. Speaking of self-centered fucks, though, the whole stop doing so much for others idea, it encourages us to check in on and measure who is doing how much of what. It encourages us, in other words, to be transactional. It's, surprise, surprise, this mirrors a narcissistic metric too. What do I get out of this? Instead of, do I feel connected here? Or is there love here? Is there warmth here? Even emotional complaints now require evidence, like some measurable imbalance to be considered valid. Saying things, for example, like, I feel unseen, therefore it's not working for me, right? That often isn't enough unless you can also prove that the other person has failed to give back what you gave in sort of quantifiable terms. And Bell Hooks, again, she talks about this in All About Love, and she urges a reevaluation of that myth. She writes that capitalist culture frames relationships as transactions, and even calls for equality can actually miss the point. What we need is mutuality. A different word, mutuality. It's a deeper, flexible sense of reciprocity that isn't about scorekeeping. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and our natural interdependence as human beings. She says, and I quote, with reciprocity, all things do not need to be equal in order for acceptance and mutuality to thrive. That's Bell Hooks, All About Love. She also invites us to recognize that our need for one another is not a flaw to fix, but a source of strength and a doorway to healing. Now, some of you still might be thinking, hey, I'm going to go for the lone wolf option. It's a whole lot easier to just not need anything, right? But we are wired for connection. I hate using cliches that kick around in the self-help world, and that one actually does sort of, incommensurably with everything else that they say. But it's true, we're wired for connection, but connection is pathologized. That they don't get that far in those discourses. We are wired for connection, but connection is pathologized. In a nutshell, when it comes to individualism, we are now trained to hone in on our dependence on one another as the key problem, when the key problem in terms of feeling lonely is more often a lack of real connection. But we're encouraged to feel shame about our needing one another at all, because we've been given this ideal of an independent, self-sufficient lone wolf whose only need is to chew on the carcasses of those they have outcompeted. And because a lot of sociologists and other thinkers are aware that we do need one another, it was a very hard job to bring that back into being not only accepted, but a necessary part of human relations. So only now this word is entering into the public discourse, not in German-speaking countries and English-speaking countries, though. Interdependence. I hope you've heard this word. Interdependence, now known as healthy and absolutely necessary. And yeah, we needed a new word for the idea of relying on one another because our culture had done such a fucking number with codependent. That word is just doomed for life, irredeemably categorized as pathological. And yet, our values in Western capitalism do not allow us to need each other. They've turned what is a basic human need into a character flaw and even a sickness. The fact that we do need each other is backed up by science, psychology, and sociology. All show that we don't need each other because we're like weak or dependent or broken or can't keep up with the times, Rather, because we're human beings and therefore actually suffer terribly without genuine connection. John Bowlby's work on attachment, which began with research on children in orphanages, showed just how severe the consequences of connection deprivation really are. Infants who are physically cared for example, but emotionally ignored, they often develop severe cognitive and psychological difficulties. Some literally fail to thrive. Yeah, that's a euphemism for dying. They died. Without emotional connection, even basic developmental processes stall and can actually stop. The body knows when it's unloved. That early research formed the basis of attachment theory and now widely accepted in psychology, and it still points to one radical truth. Connection isn't optional. It's actually a prerequisite for healthy development, nervous system regulation, emotional capacity, and long-term well-being. And we now know this across other disciplines too, like Dan Siegel's work on interpersonal neurobiology and Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. They both show how our sense of safety is co-regulated. Our bodies need the signals of those around us, facial expressions, tone of voice, presence, all that stuff, and we respond accordingly. And nervous systems are built for relational responsiveness. But instead of honouring that sensitivity as wisdom, Western capitalist culture has trained us to mistrust it. We're not just told that it's weakness or oversensitivity or pathology. There are actual so-called therapeutic approaches that retrain you to completely discount your own radar and intuition. And I'll get to exactly that in a minute, but for now the point is we respond to emotional starvation with distress, yet the system says the problem is in us. It's not. Responding to emotional starvation with distress is not dysfunction. It's actually intelligence because it's a survival mechanism. And even so, sensitivity to how others feel towards us, intuition, bodily knowledge, our culture has taught us to be ashamed of such kinds of intelligence. No, we're not even allowed to call them kinds of intelligence at all. Some of you will be like sneering at that. But being able to feel when something is wrong in a relationship, when you're not seen, when you're not met, when you don't feel safe, that is a capacity worth fighting for. That's not codependence. It's a sign that your internal systems are working, even in a world that is built to shut them down. So the sooner we reclaim that knowing and name the systems that make it dangerous, the closer we get to recovering forms of connection that don't leave us starving. And to go deeper into this, it brings me to the next Western capitalist value that we discussed in the series so far, and how it directly undermines connection. Remember the episodes on control and cognitive primacy, where we talked to value controlling both our thoughts and emotions, because supposedly having the right thoughts leads to the emotions that we want. Yeah, it was a bullshit assertion. It is important to remember that. Science shows us that emotion often precedes thought. And when it doesn't precede thought, thought and emotion are mutually informing each other simultaneously. But the idea that thoughts always come first, it's stuck anyway, because like so many lies, it's extremely profitable, and it does a lot of positive work reinforcing the system at hand. But importantly, the legacy of this lie is our pathologizing wrong thinking. Take CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. And I know you guys know I hate CBT because it is built on labeling certain kinds of thought as distorted thinking and replacing them with more rational alternatives. Right now, sometimes that is useful, sometimes, but CBT also tells us that we shouldn't assume that we know what someone else is thinking or feeling. Instead, we're trained to dismiss negative intuitions like, yeah, Bob from accounting doesn't like me, even if Bob scowls every time you walk into the room. Because CBT would say, maybe Bob isn't scowling at us. Or maybe he is, but there's like an office-wide scowling competition that we didn't know about. Or maybe Bob is scowling from some sudden stabbing pain up his ass because unbeknown to anyone, Bob has a fistula. There are all these possibilities that may be the alternatives to Bob doesn't like me. So don't imagine that you know what Bob is thinking. We're taught to treat our own emotional radar as untrustworthy. And we're encouraged to believe that our concerns about how others treat us or feel about us are unfounded. And sure, sometimes they are, But the assumption that we never know, it's dangerous because it cuts us off from one of the most valuable traits that we have, especially when it comes to recognizing unsafe or manipulative people. And that trait is intuition. And actually, we're not supposed to call it intuition. If you tell the CBT therapist, that's intuition, they'll go, no, it's mind reading. We don't encourage mind reading. And this is a rewording tactic, right? It's a clever way of making something quite normal, like having a gut feeling about something or an intuition, into something that looks clearly weird. Because, when you label intuition or gut feeling mind reading, it looks like a distortion, and not their distortion of language, your distortion of what you're capable of, like some failure in cognition, if we call it mind reading, because, it's not mind reading. That said, here's a surprise, right? We actually can read each other, like not literally look inside someone's mind or something like that. We can't know what's going through Bob's head exactly, like whether he's thinking, oh, this fistula lark is brilliant. Now I have license to scowl openly at anyone I hate. Right? We don't know that he's thinking that. But when we're emotionally connected to someone, research shows that we're actually pretty damn good at reading their mood and their energy and their inner state. And all of which amounts to, if you're going to a CBT therapist and you're living with a manipulative gaslighter and, they're stonewalling you, they haven't spoken to you for 3 days, and the therapist goes, maybe there's some other reason that they're not speaking to you, like maybe they've actually had a tongue operation and they haven't told you about it because they've had a tongue operation. No, you can end up being seriously gaslit by the situation if you don't accept that you can quite often tell exactly what's going on if people are close to you. Like if you have kids, you know this too. A kid knows if you're mad at them, even if you're trying to hide it. Like imagine you're so livid with your kid, and this happens. You're so livid that you can't say anything at all. So you're kind of giving them the silent treatment, even if that's not your intention. The kid knows. It's like, oh, what's the matter? And you're nothing. We've all heard that from our mothers as well. Like, nothing's the matter. And yeah, there's something the matter. You can feel it, and it hurts. The problem is, of course, it is deniable. Any stonewaller gets to say, I didn't do anything. It's all in your head, which is what gaslighting is, right? And your nervous system, in the meantime, is just screaming, I know you're mad at me. Then you go to your CBT therapy session, and if they are not up to scratch, they may even gaslight you too, with a suggestion that, you don't know that the stonewaller was deliberately ignoring you. Because, maybe they were on LSD and experiencing any sensory input at all was just too much for them, and so they couldn't do it. Or they might have had such a rough day at work that it induced periodic paralysis of the tongue. And all of these ways of finding other explanations for the thing that on a gut level is the case are just ways of decoupling us from our intuition. And, even if you do take the humour out of it, even if Bob is just indiscriminately prickish to everyone, or your partner was on LSD, the bigger point still stands. You are not wrong to notice when things feel off. You're just taught to doubt it. So let's get technical for a second. The ability to sense others' emotions and intentions is actually well documented. Neuroscientific research on mirror neurons shows that our brains are wired to internally simulate what we perceive others experiencing. When someone looks hurt or angry, we don't just observe it. Our own nervous systems feel it too. And this is part of what makes empathy possible. Dan Siegel's work on attunement reinforces this. He writes that relationships become emotionally safe and nourishing when we are seen, soothed, safe and secure. And that requires sensitivity. Not just what's said, but what's felt. And Luis Cozzolino, in The Neuroscience of Human Relationships, argues that our brains literally develop in relation with others. Emotional resonance isn't indulgence, it's actually the foundation of connection and development. And then there's Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, which you guys probably know about. It teaches us that our nervous systems are constantly scanning for cues of safety and danger in others, often below the level of conscious awareness. So like that tight feeling in your stomach when, someone is just a bit off with you. It's not overthinking. It's neurobiological attunement. That's your body doing what it's meant to do. And often, particularly in marginalized communities, this isn't just emotional nuance, it's survival. You all know this too if you grew up in an unsupervised psychiatric ward like I did, or anywhere else where chaos reigned and danger could erupt at any time, emotionally or physically. You will know if you grew up in places like that, and this includes adult children of alcoholics and things like this. You will know that reading the room accurately can be the difference between staying safe and getting hurt. But here's the thing: in a culture that prizes disconnection, we are told to see this very form of intelligence as irrational. We're told to call it paranoia or catastrophizing or being too sensitive. We label people as needy or difficult when they express discomfort. And even if that discomfort is often a finely tuned signal that something is wrong and you're picking up on it. And it is worth noting that it's often the very people who do not want to be held accountable for their actions that will tell us these things. My mother, who was a covert narcissist, she used to say all of the above stuff. You're catastrophizing. You're too sensitive. You're just imagining things. So, I was not supposed to ever see her as the problem. I should blame myself. And, this is where narcissism on the micro level, like the example of my mother, is the same as the narcissism on the macro level, a cultural level. But you might be wondering, why does this matter? Because intimacy depends on attunement. If I can't trust my read on how you're feeling, right? Say I'm dating you and I can't trust, that I know, that I can sense how you're feeling. Or worse, I've just been trained to ignore it, right? How could I safely connect with you? I might end up just sort of stuffing down the sort of fear that alerts me to the fact that you're about to use a shovel on my skull. Or it might go the other way. I might ignore the feelings of warmth that tell me you're actually a genuinely kind and safe person, despite the fact you accidentally stepped on my dog. And if we treat sensitivity as dysfunction, we break the very thing that allows people to feel seen and met. The price of this disconnection, it's not just loneliness, it's relational poverty. A world where people are surrounded by others, but feel entirely alone. Oops, apologies for another terrible transition I didn't even know was terrible. But the section that I'm up to is control. We're now going to hone in on control, right? And how control creates hierarchy and not connection. So, control is not only a value in Western capitalist culture, it's actually a total aspiration. It is also a total danger because when applied to connecting, this is where manipulation can take center stage. Gaslighting, blame shifting, silent treatments, all these tactics that can be used in the context of connection and inherently destroy it. So to control and connection, they just do not mix, as research by the Goldmans demonstrates. And yet, the push to control all aspects of our lives is there. We're told that taking control is what gives you what you want. And in the context of connection, this is fatal. When the desire to control enters a relationship, what is really going on is power over the other person, because true connection requires mutuality. The Germans have a word that I like. I don't say this very often. It's called auf Augenhöhe. That means, eye to eye. We're on a level. So connection requires people being on a level, eye to eye. And control, on the other hand, it installs hierarchy. One person is on the top, being in control, and the other is below. So mutuality evaporates. And connection, in the sense of, that human being need, is gone. And we're going to bring up Bell Hooks again, this time chapter 2 of her book All About Love. Chapter 2 is called Justice, Childhood Love Lessons. And Hooks says that most of us are socialised into the idea that love and control are bound together. We're taught that authority, dominance and obedience are normal parts of close relationships, especially in childhood. But this confuses control with care, and it confuses obedience with love. That conditioning continues into adulthood too. And if you've ever been in a relationship with a cluster B nightmare, people who must at all times feel they are in control, you'll know how the ache of feeling totally alone, whilst technically in a relationship, feels. As you guys know, and I know it personally too, because I've lived in narcissistic family systems and dated narcissists, and I sometimes wonder if I just date case studies. Anyway, they weren't just painful connections, they were simulations of connection. And I can only echo what all of the research says. I can echo it from personal experience. Control kills intimacy. And worse, it stops you from forming real connections elsewhere. because being in controlling relationships, it totally eats up your emotional bandwidth and it drives you slowly nuts. Not slowly, really. It can drive you nuts pretty quickly. Relationships of control, that they do a similar thing to what society does when it gaslights you into thinking that this is all your own fault. It drives you fucking nuts. And, even outside of overt abuse, power dynamics still fracture connection. Now, you can feel just as lonely in a long-term relationship where love has quietly disappeared, but the structure of the relationship is still there and relies on control, like who sacrifices more, who carries the more emotional labor, who makes the final decisions. These more subtle hierarchies, they can go unquestioned because they're baked into how we imagine love is supposed to work. And this is especially true in nuclear family setups, where two adults are expected to raise children and maintain a household with little outside support. And one partner often becomes the emotional manager while the other becomes emotionally unavailable. And that is not intimacy, that is bureaucracy. And it leaves both people feeling profoundly alone. And that's not about blame, that is about systems. We were never meant to love this way. It is our core cultural values that deform and cripple connection. So now let's move to the other value that we've discussed in depth so far in the series. Capitalist closeness equals performance. And this is about competition. We're going to talk about what competition really means when it comes to intimacy under capitalism. Because it's not always the kind of shiny winner-takes-all competition that we're used to imagining, right? Particularly when we're looking for meaningful connections. It's more about the things that we do to avoid fucking it up, right? Because, remember with control, anything that goes awry is our fault, which we talked about in episode 3. So more and more, we're trained to monitor ourselves, not just in public, but in our closest relationships, especially in our closest relationships. We learn to audit our words, our tone, our reactions, and even our silences. And we run post-mortems on everything, like our texts, for example, particularly when the person we're engaging with is a potential romantic dyad person. We will even ask friends, did I come on too strong in this text? Can you read all of these texts that we exchanged? Did I come on too strong? Was I too emotional? Did I over-explain? Was I too much? So, this isn't the confidence strut of someone trying to dominate the race, because, let's face it, that kind of behavior is insufferable anyway and will run away. For a lot of us, this is more like the jittery hypervigilance of someone who's been traumatized by the race, but is still desperately trying not to get disqualified, not to get abandoned, not to screw it up again because we think this is the only race in town. And here's the crap fit, not the perfect fit, the crap fit. Self-help narratives will often call this process self-betterment. And really, is it self-betterment or is it self-beratement? Because it certainly feels like that a lot of the time. It's not a journey of growth necessarily. It's a cycle of self-flagellation, followed by the sort of self-correction that still holds on to the idea of our flawedness and the need to overcompensate for it. It is essentially a never-ending effort to sand down our rough edges so we can be more palatable, less risky, and more acceptable. Because in a capitalist culture obsessed with control, everything bad that happens to you is your fault. That relationship that failed, your fault. You weren't emotionally intelligent enough. You weren't healed enough. You got triggered, or you didn't communicate just right. And the friendship that fizzled, also your fault. You should have set better boundaries, should have regulated your nervous system better, should have used I statements instead of sounding, God forbid, hurt. And the underlying message is, under no circumstances, be yourself. It's horrible. And we internalize this until it becomes second nature if anything goes wrong. It's because of what we did, because of what I did. So, now my job isn't just to live, it's to preempt disaster, to monitor myself so closely that no part of me can ever ruin anything again. And this is where control morphs into internalized competition, not with others, but with ourselves, with a past version of us, with a version, that fucked stuff up before. And as we discussed in section 5, this is where we enter that Sartrean, Foucauldian, internalized audience nightmare. We are always already humiliated for having fucked up totally and been yourself again. There, in your internal crowd, is also the self-help author who kicks you again for being down, saying the only person who can sort this out is you. And you're there too, as both the accused and the judge, as both the actor and the critic, and you feel like someone sees your every failing, because they do. That someone is you, and you're terrifying and terrified. So connection becomes performance. And not necessarily because we're narcissistic, but because we're shit scared of getting it wrong, or of being that version of ourselves that always gets it wrong. And we don't want to be that flawed version. We want to be the perfect version that we're striving towards, because that perfect version, surely that gets love. The old version, who did all those fuck-ups, that person would enter the wrong kind of relationship again. They would get discarded again. And more than anything, we just don't want to fuck it up. Like the other person can't do that for us. And because we've been taught that our truth is too much, we edit ourselves before anyone else can reject us. This is the tragedy of so-called self-improvement. It doesn't actually teach us to love ourselves. It teaches us to interrogate ourselves constantly. It teaches us to manage and mitigate our own needs like they're threats. It's not a liberation. It's internalized surveillance. And the cruelest part, if we perform connection well enough, if we do the work and keep our shit in check, we may actually get connection. But we're never going to feel safe in it, because we'll never believe we earned it as our real selves, because we didn't. We'll be obliged to keep up this performance of someone who we are not, and we'll stay stuck in this loop, polishing a mask, curating our lives so we look right to outsiders, running interference on our own instincts, hoping that this time, if we get it perfect enough, we'll be safe. And if we find love in this way, if someone loves the mask, they still don't love us. There's still that break in the connection, because what they love is a performance, and you're obliged to keep it up because you may not want to let go of that actual not relationship, which is existing between two facades. And this is what Lauren Berlant names cruel optimism. I like this word, cruel optimism. The tragic bind, where the very things we're told will save us are the things that harm us most. The belief that, if we just heal harder, perform better, self-manage more perfectly, we'll finally become more lovable. And all we do is deepen our alienation, because love earned through performance is never really felt. And safety bought through self-erasure, that doesn't protect us. Instead, in internalizing the values Western culture inculcates in us, we remain attached to fantasies that actively undermine the things that we're trying to reach. The promise of what to do to find connection becomes the prison that excludes us from finding it. And now I want to talk about the antidote, right? Community. And, really, this is all kind of deconstruction. We're not supposed to propose other systems when doing deconstruction. But otherwise, it all gets pretty bleak, because obviously, it's broken. I will leave you with that now. Here's the antidote, community. So, if control kills intimacy, and performance strangles connection, then the antidote is not more strategy. It's not better boundaries or better communication or being a better version of you. It's not another self-help book on emotional literacy. It is community. It is actual community, not the buzzword, not the app, not the podcast or the Facebook platform. I mean people. I mean real, messy, reciprocal relationships. The ones that don't rely on performance or perfection or pathology. And bell hooks again. I read a lot of bell hooks for this. Bell hooks, but quoting M. Scott Peck in her book All About Love, she describes community as a group of individuals who are moved beyond the surface, who've learned to communicate honestly, and who've dropped the masks of composure, and who have committed to delight in one another, to mourn together, and to make each other's conditions their own. That is, to live inside a shared humanity rather than outside it. And yet this is not a call for kumbaya hug groups. It is a call for radical reevaluation of our emotional economies. Hooks calls this a love ethic, and it sits in direct opposition to the capitalist ethic of domination, self-reliance, and profit. The love ethic says loyalty matters, slowness matters, vulnerability matters, people matter. Living by a love ethic, she writes, we learn to value loyalty and a commitment to sustained bonds over material advancement. And that's the revolution in terms of going against capitalist values, because everything we've been taught runs counter to that. Capitalism tells us to treat relationships like side quests to the main goal of productivity. It teaches us that like care work is invisible and not valued and not paid well. It teaches us that being needed is weakness and that depending on others is somehow regressive, when the truth is intimacy cannot exist without interdependence. There is no such thing as closeness with control and no such thing as mutuality without risk. And so the real work is not in perfecting ourselves to finally earn connection. It's not in finally getting the performance of ourselves right. The real work is in building spaces where perfection is not the price of entry, and where we're allowed to fuck up and be forgiven and repair, where people can just be raw and real and held without us feeling the need to somehow fix them. That's community. It's not convenience, it's not performance, but a culture where showing up as you are, come as you are. Kurt Cobain was right. Come as you are is the only credential you need, where our truth is not too much and where our softness is not a liability. Rather, it's a strength. So, if we are going to resist the system, there's something we need to do. We need to reclaim dependency. Dependency, one of those words that we're taught to hear it and go, oh, that's a bad word. We need to reclaim dependency as a good thing. If we are going to resist this system, the loneliness machine masquerading as self-help, that's the system, we have to start by reclaiming what has taught us to despise. We have to start by reclaiming what it has told us are things that we don't want to do. Dependency, intuition, softness, relational intelligence. These are not flaws. They are the parts of us that remain human in a world that just keeps trying to make us into robots and AIs. There are reasons we ache in the absence of love. They are the evidence that something in us still knows how to belong, even if we don't have the context around us to do it. We've been taught to pathologize dependency, to see interdependence as codependence, to flinch from our own longing as if it were shameful. But what if our longing is actually the compass? What if our need is not weakness? What if it's wisdom? Bell Hooks says, rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. And she's right. We do not recover by gritting our teeth and getting more resilient. We recover when we are seen, when we are met, when someone holds our trembling, unpolished selves and says, you don't have to be perfect to be loved. Because in a culture that wants us compliant, ashamed, and endlessly self-managing, choosing to need one another is revolutionary. So let's reclaim our dependency. Let's stop pretending that disconnection is strength and that loneliness is a personal failure. It's not. It's a structural wound. And healing it is not going to come from fixing ourselves personally and all alone. It will come from refusing to abandon each other. It will come from not just automatically shouting, get therapy to everyone, and instead caring enough to listen to and see each other. And I was reminded of that the other weekend when I met someone that was capable of connection, reminding me that such people are out there. You guys are out there. I'm here doing this. There are people who are capable of connection. So with another terrible transition, sorry guys, today I just keep needing to stop and start again. To summarize, to pull it all together, this episode set out to name the pattern beneath everything we've explored so far. That Western capitalist values don't just fail to support connection, they actively undermine it. The result isn't accidental, it's designed. Independence has become a moral ideal, so our natural need for others has become pathologized. The romantic dyad is framed as the only legitimate source of intimacy, and then we're shamed for depending on it. Control is seen as strength, even though it kills the mutuality that connection requires. Competition teaches us we're only lovable when we're flawless, so connection becomes performance. And therapy, whilst sometimes helpful, it does often reinforce the idea that the problem is you and not the culture that raised you. And as Foucault reminds us, what culture calls sick or dysfunctional is often just whatever threatens its dominant values. And in this system, real connection is threatening because it requires truth, vulnerability, and interdependence. So those things get framed as flaws, as weakness, as codependence. It's kind of another version of divide and conquer. If we don't need each other, we can't come together. And that's not an accident either. Interdependence is not sickness. It is what makes us human. Loneliness isn't a personal failing. It's the outcome of a system that punishes the very things that make connection possible. And when you feel the ache of that, that is not dysfunction. That is your intelligence. That is your nervous system saying, this is not how it's meant to be. And your nervous system is right. Now, on the note of community and needing one another, I really thank you for being here and for listening and for your comments, the interactions. It's, for me, you can probably tell as someone who's had, kind of a challenging life, as a lot of us have. You're not watching this because your life was easy. I would like to keep this going, and I would like to turn it into a community project where I can actually offer people the space to come together to be themselves, and of course offer spaces for philosophical discussions. So I'm setting up a Patreon page, which is sort of most of the way there, and please don't go check it out, because there's different tiers, like everything from Q&As to philosophy discussion groups to one-on-one time with me, depending on the level of support that you can give, because I actually can't keep doing this without assistance. No one can operate as a totally independent being, as we talk about so often on this podcast. So your assistance would be really, really appreciated. It makes a huge difference, even if all you do is the lowest tier, because if everyone that listened did that, I would be able to continue doing this, which is really what I would love to do. So if you're interested in sessions with me, in philosophy discussions, in Q&As, do go check out Patreon. If you're just interested in helping the podcast keep going, you can go to thelonelinessindustry.net. There is a donate button on the top right-hand side, and you can do that as a one-off or monthly. And just any way that you can assist, and if you have no cash at all, just share it with a friend who you know suffers from loneliness, or share it on your Facebook page, because that helps too, to find the people who need this and may want to get involved in the communities that I want to build around it. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you for your time. I know this was a long episode too, so those of you that made it to the end, you have my utmost respect. You're a good listener. So I will see you in 2 weeks' time, and thanks again for being here.